The letter from the bank was 4 sentences long. It arrived on a Thursday morning in March of 1985 at the Brennan farm outside Cahir in County Tipperary. Fionnuala Brennan took it from the post and set it on the kitchen table without opening it, the way she had learned to set bank correspondence since the early 1980s when the letters had started arriving with more regularity. Her 2 sons, Seamus and Declan, were in from the morning milking by 7:30. She put the kettle on and left the letter on the table between them. Seamus opened it. He read it twice. He handed it to Declan without comment. The letter said that the bank was conducting a review of its agricultural lending portfolio and that, as part of that review, the Brennan Accounts Operating Credit Facility would be adjusted from its current limit of £14,000 to £11,000, effective from the 1st of May. It said the bank valued their custom and that a representative would be available to discuss the matter if required. It was signed by someone in the lending department whose name neither of them recognized. 4 sentences. £3,000 less credit from May onwards. Seamus and Declan Brennan read the same 4 sentences and understood them to mean different things. That difference, and what each of them decided to do about it, would shape the next 3 years of the farm's history in ways that neither a longer letter nor a clearer one could have prevented. Same 4 sentences, read the exact same thing, and walked away with completely different plans. That ain't stubbornness, ain't ignorance either. It's just that what you bring to the table changes what the words mean. Happens every time. The Brennan farm was 140 acres of mixed ground in the Suir Valley. Grass for the dairy herd, some tillage on the flatter fields to the east, and rough grazing on the hill ground that had never been worth improving. Their father, Padraig, had built the dairy herd from 14 cows to 62 over 30 years and had handed the operation to his 2 sons in 1979 when his health had made the early mornings impossible. He had handed it to both of them jointly, which had seemed reasonable at the time, and had created a decision-making structure that worked well when the 2 of them agreed and required patience when they did not. The early 1980s in Irish farming had been difficult. Interest rates had climbed through the late 1970s and into the early 1980s as inflation ran high and the Irish pound came under pressure. The land debt the Brennans carried, £68,000 taken on in 1976 to buy the eastern tillage fields, was at a variable rate that had moved from 12% to 18% between 1979 and 1982, before settling back toward 15% by 1985. That movement had cost them money they had not budgeted and had compressed the operating margin that the dairy herd generated. By early 1985, they were managing carefully, but not comfortably. The £14,000 operating credit facility was not a luxury. It covered seed and fertilizer for the tillage acres, veterinary costs for the herd through the winter, and the fuel and repair costs that accumulated between the milk check payments that arrived monthly from the creamery. Without the full facility, something would have to give. Seamus was 38. He had been reading bank correspondence for 6 years, and he had developed, through that reading, a particular sensitivity to the language financial institutions used when they were preparing to do something more significant than what the letter said. The phrase conducting a review of its agricultural lending portfolio was not, in his experience, the language of a bank that had made a routine administrative adjustment. It was the language of a bank that was systematically reducing its exposure to agricultural accounts, and wanted to do so in a way that gave each individual farmer the impression that their situation was being considered on its own merits. He believed the £3,000 reduction was not the end of the process. He believed it was the first step. Declan was 35. He read the same letter and reached a different conclusion. He saw a bank that had communicated clearly, given reasonable notice, and offered to discuss the matter. He saw a £3,000 reduction that was inconvenient but manageable. They could reduce the fertilizer rate on the eastern field by one application, delay the veterinary TB testing by 6 weeks, and draw the facility down more carefully through the spring. He saw a situation that required adjustment, not alarm. He also saw something that Seamus had not mentioned. The letter had arrived in March, 2 months before the May effective date. That was time. Time to restructure, to negotiate, to ask the question that the letter had not answered, whether the review was ongoing or concluded, and whether the £11,000 facility was a floor or a waypoint.
They talked about it that evening after their mother had gone to bed. The kitchen table, the same one the letter had sat on that morning, held 2 cups of tea and the letter itself, which Seamus had read a third time during the day, and Declan had not looked at again. Seamus said he thought they needed to act quickly. He said the review language was significant and that in his reading of how banks operated in the current environment, an account that had already been reduced once was more likely to be reduced again than an account that had not been touched. He said they should go to the bank and restructure the entire operating facility before the May date, convert it from a variable revolving line to a fixed term loan with defined repayment terms that could not be adjusted unilaterally by the bank during the term. He said locking the amount and the terms now, while their account was still in reasonable standing, was better than negotiating from a weaker position later. Declan said he thought Seamus was reading more into the letter than was there. He said the bank had reduced their line by a standard amount with standard notice, and that going in to restructure immediately would signal anxiety to the lending officer. Anxiety that might draw more attention to the account than leaving it alone would. He said they should wait, make no sudden moves, and see whether the May adjustment was followed by further communication. If it was, they could act then with more information than they had now. Seamus said waiting was how accounts ended up in difficulty. Declan said rushing was how accounts ended up overextended. Neither of them raised their voice. They had been having versions of this conversation for 6 years, and they had learned that the argument was never really about the immediate question. It was about 2 different theories of how precaution worked. Seamus's theory that problems announced themselves early and rewarded early action, and Declan's theory that visible anxiety invited the scrutiny it was trying to avoid. Both theories had evidence behind them. Neither had been conclusively proved right by anything that had happened on the farm to date. 2 brothers, same kitchen table, same farm, same problem, and both of them were right. That's the hard part right there. When the other person ain't wrong, just different. You can't argue your way out of that one. Got to find another way through. They agreed eventually that Declan would wait and Seamus would act, not in opposition but in sequence. It was not a dramatic resolution. It was the kind of compromise that 2 people reach when they have been making decisions together long enough to understand that neither of them is reliably right and that acting on 2 different theories simultaneously costs less than committing entirely to one. Declan would hold his position through April and manage the spring inputs carefully within the existing facility. Seamus would go to the bank in early April and ask not about restructuring, which Declan still believed would signal the wrong thing, but about the nature of the review, whether it was complete, what criteria had been applied, whether the account could expect further adjustments before the year was out. He would ask as a customer seeking information, not as a borrower seeking terms. He would not signal anxiety. He would ask a specific question and listen carefully to how it was answered and to how it was not answered, which was often more informative. He went to the bank on a Tuesday in early April. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. The lending officer he spoke with was not the person who had signed the letter. That person, it emerged, had left the bank 3 weeks earlier. The lending officer who met with Seamus had reviewed the file before the meeting and was prepared to discuss it. What Seamus learned in those 40 minutes was that the review was ongoing, that the bank's agricultural portfolio had been flagged for reduction by the head office in Dublin, and that accounts in the Brennan's general profile, variable rate land debt, mixed enterprise, moderate size, had been identified as candidates for further facility reductions in the autumn. The lending officer did not say this directly. He said it through the specific things he was willing to confirm and the specific things he declined to address. And Seamus had enough experience with bank conversations to read the shape of what was said and what was not. He came home and told Declan what he had heard and what he had inferred. Declan agreed that Seamus had inferred correctly. They went back to the bank together the following week and restructured the operating facility into a fixed-term arrangement of £11,000 for 3 years at a defined rate. They gave up the flexibility of a revolving line.
They gained 3 years of certainty that the bank could not reduce the facility further during that period. In the autumn of 1985, the bank reduced the operating credit facilities of several dozen agricultural accounts in Tipperary and the surrounding counties as the portfolio review that had begun in spring was completed. Accounts that had already converted to fixed-term arrangements were not affected. Those were defined contracts with terms that held. Accounts that had remained on the revolving structure were adjusted. Declan had been partially right. The initial £3,000 reduction in March had not been followed by immediate further action. There had been 6 months between the March letter and the autumn adjustments. The time he had suggested waiting through had been real. Seamus had been more right. The review had been ongoing, the autumn adjustment had come, and accounts that had acted in April were in a different position in October than accounts that had waited. One of the farms in the valley, a man they knew from the mart, a careful farmer who had read the March letter as Declan had and waited for more information before deciding, had his facility reduced by a further £4,000 in October on top of the spring reduction. By December, he had sold 22 acres of his hill ground to cover the gap in his operating position. The land sold at a price that was below what it would have brought 2 years earlier. The Brennan brothers did not discuss this with the man at the mart. It was not a thing that wanted discussion. The letter from March 1985 had been 4 sentences. It had not said that a larger adjustment was coming in the autumn. It had not said that it was the first communication in a sequence rather than a standalone event. It had not said anything about how the lending officer who signed it would leave 3 weeks later, or what the head office in Dublin had decided about agricultural portfolios in the Midlands counties. It had said that the credit facility was being adjusted and that a representative would be available to discuss the matter if required. Seamus had read that as a warning. Declan had read it as a courtesy. The letter had not been either of those things. It had been a document, 4 sentences, carrying information that depended entirely on what the reader brought to it.